This is a Radical Exchange production. Today, I welcome to the podcast Nick Vincent of Northwestern University and Yakov Feygin of the Berggruen Institute. The backstory to this conversation is a lengthy research collaboration focused on how the value of data gets captured, and with that in mind, how to design a tax that would fairly redistribute it. Along with researchers Brent Hecht, Hanlin Lee, Louisa Scarcella, Chirag Lala, and others, Nick, Yakov, and I worked on this together for much of 2019 and 2020. You can see the results of our collaboration at datadividends.org, a proposal for a simple, eminently implementable tax that would go to the heart of the economic distortion caused by the data economy. In this conversation, we focus on how data and other assets get their value, compare data policy to the industrial policy of the Depression era, and much more. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I am Matt Pruitt, and this is Radical Exchanges with Nick Vincent and Yakov Feygin.
So I thought we should start by introducing the two of you a little bit. We have worked together a lot over the past year, and I've gotten to know you guys well in sort of a quasi-professional setting. But I'd love to hear, in your own words, sort of what it is that you do, and how you found your way to the work that you're doing now. So maybe we start with Nick.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good. So I'm Nick Vincent, and I'm right now a fourth-year Ph.D. student at Northwestern in the Technology and Social Behavior program, which is a kind of unique interdisciplinary joint program. So it's half in the School of Computer Science and half in communication. And I guess the research areas that I kind of like identify with are computer science, but also human-computer interaction, machine learning, and social computing. And the big question, or the big broad overview of what I'm interested in, is trying to measure the value of people's data and make them aware of it, and then develop tools that make it easier for people to kind of collectively act around the value of that data. And so I guess we'll talk more about that all throughout here. But the idea is that maybe the public can can basically act on these powerful, intelligent technologies like AI that have started to dominate a lot of media discussions of technology, and kind of take advantage of the fact that ultimately the public and we as a collective are responsible for the success of these technologies. So in terms of what I do in like my day-to-day, it's mostly writing research papers, and that kind of ranges from collecting data about online platforms, about search engines, platforms like Reddit, Wikipedia, Stack Overflow, and also doing experiments that draw on research methods from machine learning. So setting up models and training models to do machine learning tasks and looking at how the performance is different in different situations. And so I've kind of adopted a lot of methods from machine learning and social computing for that. Yeah, that's about it. Anything else you had in mind?
How'd you get so interested in data?
Oh, yeah.
What was it that brought you into that?
So I guess it started with, this is also kind of why I ended up at this PhD program. I was interested in the broad topic of intelligent technology exacerbating wealth and economic inequality, and the many downstream effects that come from that. So before I was a PhD student, I worked as a web developer for a while. And I also did research when I was an undergrad. I did some research in machine learning for neurology at my school, which was UCLA in California. And I also did research on acoustics, signal processing acoustic data at the Naval Research Labs in San Diego. And so I was really just doing, this research was very much applied and mostly just math and coding, and mostly just signal processing specifically. And I wanted to kind of understand how data was more broadly connected to society and to things like economic inequality and its downstream effects. So that's kind of the trajectory that brought me to this PhD program now.
Was there something you noticed about the way that data was being used in the work that you were doing before you got into this PhD program, for example, that made you think, there's a deeper question here than most people realize?
Yeah, so I guess it's something that I think is kind of like almost a running joke for many people in the machine learning community, which is that the day-to-day work of a data scientist or a machine learning engineer is just oftentimes utterly divorced from the actual process of collecting and creating data. So it's really easy to spend lots of time trying different models out and different hyperparameters and doing graduate student descent and stuff like that without ever really thinking about the activities and the social context and all the things that had to happen to get your data in the first place. And that's not quite as applicable to things like neurology and acoustics as it is to maybe like social media data, but it still is. Even these things that seem like really highly specific domains are produced under these really complex social dynamics and these. I mean, with at risk of sounding like saying we live in a society, it's really easy to do the work of data science and not think about the fact we live in a society. So I think that was kind of a factor for me.
All right, let's put a pin in that. I would love to dig in on the difference between social data and data for neurology or something like that.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. But Yakov Feygin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I came to this with probably the oddest background you can find to it. I'm actually an economic historian. Used to be an economist and then became so institutionalist I became a historian. And I never worked on data or honestly was interested in data until I moved to California and was working and am still working in a policy shop that has a lot of work with California politics. And basically my first week at this job, my boss came up to me and said, there's this discussion of a data dividend in California. We think there might be something there. And we want you involved with it. And I was shocked because I had never thought of the issue and I honestly was pretty skeptical of any kind of social policy that's just a pay for using an individual's data. I thought it couldn't actually be worth that much, right? But that's kind of how I fell into it. And, when I started looking through it, I'm like, I thought there were really interesting historical analogies. And as I started going through the literature, especially actually the work of, what's his name? Oh my God, I'm sorry. But whatever, it doesn't matter, but it'll come to me in a second. But the analogy to utility problems and to the installation of new technologies really kind of made something click in my head. And what I thought is well, look, this isn't just a problem of classical valuation, which actually is something, Matt, you kind of made me think about, right? This is a problem of how to understand the social, value of a collective resource, which is for an almost impossible in some level economic problem with conventional economics. But when you think about institutionalism, right? The old economics in the 1920s to in the 50s, right? That created the New Deal and much of the American state actually that still functions. It's not that hard of a problem. It's a problem of utilities and the proper uses of law to create public control. Mm-hmm. And that kind of, when I realized that, I began to think that this went from kind of something very sci-fi that to, my practical brain of let's just focus on getting the tax base right, getting institutions funded, doing the right kind of fiscal policy, which is the world I'm born in and really work in for the most part, right? To going, there might actually be something really interesting here and a real alternative to the traditional kind of division between regulation through antitrust and then regulation through, individual, some kind of market-based individual payment scheme. That there might be some third option, which is this utilization option that I think we all came on to, right? Is more about reconfiguring the way this market works, more so than just accepting it and trying to tweak around the edges, really, which I think those two radical other approaches are doing, right?
Yeah. So you said something very interesting there, about the distinction between looking at it as a valuation problem or looking at it as a sort of an institutional control problem. Can you flesh that out a little?
Sure. I mean, most simply, right?
And I think maybe actually just to to make this more accessible to listeners who might be just jumping right in, can you give an example that doesn't have to do with data?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sure. So in Econ 101, right, you come in and you learn marginal pricing. right? That's the kind of dominant neoclassical model, as we call it. And the marginal pricing model is just, the price is the average marginal cost of making the next item. So like, let's think about oranges, right? The price of an orange is the marginal cost of picking and marketing another orange, right? And that's why you have the price code, right? Now that's not true. No, that's not true for the real world. And what, conventional textbooks will do is they'll try to introduce frictions and try to kind of say this is the ideal state. And in the real world, there are frictions, right? But it's still the theory. If you're an institutionalist, especially an old institutionalist, you come at it a little differently, right? You come to think about, okay, what are the pricing powers that come from the a priori distributional factors and pricing factors that come in to create this market rather than thinking about what a perfect market is in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And then price becomes less of a function. And in fact, if you go down, there are some institutions that think markets don't set prices at all. There are people who think that most prices are, even in a capitalist economy, are administered, like something like, there are some studies that suggest 65% of prices aren't even determined by markets, but concentration of firms, right? Or firm concentration. That's a whole other debate that I don't think we have time to get into, right? But I think there's something to that. So the problem isn't to, create the perfect market for data, right? The problem is to regulate these institutions properly, right, so that you can get a stake back from the use of what we, I think, all around here consider a common resource.
So would it be just to try to bring that into simpler terms? It's basically, correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that if we just look at assets in terms of what their sort of correct valuation is, we miss this other question of what the sort of institutional background is that creates the situation in which the prices are determined.
Exactly, right? So coming back to the example of the orange, it's not the orange in isolation of its marginal value. It's, for example, the fact that there's a monopsony, right, within grocery stores in the area that sets the value, right? The really, really classic kind of pop example is the famous Pete Buttigieg interview, right? Where it wasn't the market that was creating pricing decisions on the Canadian bread, right? It was McKinsey trying to figure out how much purchase power, how to set the right price to get through the price target and in each sector, right? Right. The really famous meme of the journalist going, "You work for a company that manipulated bread prices." I actually don't think that's exactly right. You just quote unquote work for a company. No one's manipulating prices here because there's no objective really price, right? But that opens up a whole different vista of thinking about how to do policy, right? So instead of improving market imperfections, which is the traditional way you think about it, you have to think about creating the market a priori.
Right. So speaking personally, one of the things that led me to thinking this way about all different kinds of markets actually is simply the problem of land. Mm-hmm. So thinking about how land gets its value, through sort of college and my conventional economics education, I really just sort of never asked myself these kinds of questions. I just thought about, there are assets and then they have value, but I never really thought about, what's behind the asset. Why is the asset an asset? And land, I think, is a great example. I mean, maybe it's not the best example because it already kind of asks people to question some basic assumptions that they're probably making in order to see that example. But I still think it's a great, it's a little bit more tangible than data. So it helps, it does help make the point, I think. The point being that when we think about the value of land, if we ask ourselves, how can we sort of, price it more accurately, for example, we're sort of laundering away this entire area of inquiry about why it is that land is being bought and sold.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, that's the class. There's a historical kind of parable we teach in introductory economic history, which is actually a very contested one. And I've actually stopped teaching it, to be honest, because I'm not sure how true it is anymore. But enclosure, right? The classical story of enclosure being the thing that creates capitalism, right? That you had these medieval economies in which land ownership wasn't the same kind of right that it used to be, that anyone in the community could graze on the land because it was considered a common property, right? And then, you get a legal regime change and land becomes literally a commodity and thus owned by the lord. So essentially becomes enclosed, and there are rents to be paid to graze your sheep on, and thus you have migration into cities, right? Because people are displaced. That little change now kind of contested as to when, how, why that happened, but that was always the classical kind of primitive accumulation story you got, right, about the rise of capitalism. And that's exactly, and it's a great kind of, but even if it's not historically true, I still think it's a great story to tell, right?
Right. And there's also, this connects to the idea about the rise of cities, and, how did urban land become valuable? The idea being that the reason urban land is so valuable is that there's this whole network of activity going on around it, which means that holding title to a piece of urban land gives you access to this whole network that the owner of the land didn't create. Mm-hmm. So that the sort of the institutional shape of the thing that we're buying and selling, might not match with the actual sort of value creation process behind it.
Yep, exactly. Right. That's that famous rent share, right? We always talk about.
Yeah. So this connects with data. How does this connect with data? how is, there are obviously analogies and disanalogies galore here, but how, and this is for, both of you, how does this story that we're telling connect to the way we should understand data and the digital economy?
I think the kind of key breakthrough, and this was something I think, Nick, you really explained to me more, you and Han Lin really explained to me that I think I understood intuitively, but never really understood the implications of it, is, the little bits of information we're generating are like data stream in our activities, right? It's not that valuable, right? Because it makes sense, right? How much predictive value does one subject's preferences really have, right? Not that much, apparently, right? In machine learning.
Yeah.
A whole lot of subjects
together
that you can compare, right? That's a lot of, that seems to be a lot more valuable, right? So it's not really our personal data stream that's valuable. It's really the fact that you're mapping social interactions that aren't considered, quote unquote, in the economy, much like land wasn't at one point considered in, quote unquote, the economy, right? Of commodity production or commodities. That's the thing that's new, right? And it's not, so it's very hard, practically impossible to say, how much any of our data is worth relative to one another. But then it becomes a lot easier to think about in aggregation. So it's it becomes a way of saying, okay, you are taking snapshots of society and generating value to it, which is a really interesting way of thinking through, okay, now what is society owed back? And how do you regulate the terms of access to that information? Right. Especially because if you're scaling, there's seem to be more and more returns to scale, which reminds you a lot of something like a natural monopoly, an electrical company. And we know how to deal with that. We have regulation, we have ways of regulating that, taxing that, setting prices on that are pretty well known and have been encountered over and over again as we kind of deal with these kind of things. And then you can begin to kind of see a way of solving the problems.
So there's I think there's kind of a technical way of describing what you just described, which is that, data has this kind of increasing returns to scale characteristic. so that, if you, and this, I know this gets complicated, but, as a general matter, the way that you just described it, data is more valuable in combination than individually. So that there's sort of when we combine many people's data, we get something that's worth more than the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah, it's a natural monopoly.
Yeah.
Or networking, right?
And so but the way that I kind of like to think about this in less quantitative terms, I guess, is it's like the difference between a whole and a part. So that if you have, if you were to take a painting and tear it into 100 pieces and sell the pieces, each of those pieces would be worth less than 100th the value of the painting, because you've destroyed the whole by cutting it up into parts, right? And so in a way, the way that I think about this kind of increasing returns to scale stuff that we often frame in quantitative or economic terms is that that's what's going on. I mean, when we have a lot of data contributed from a lot of different sources, that adds up to something more valuable than it, greater than the sum of its parts. It's like that. Is that a fair way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a really great analogy.
Yeah, I would want to add, so one complexity that actually is kind of important, though, is that a really common characteristic, if you look at a particular technology, a technology that does a specific task. So I want to have a system that detects cars. It tells me if a picture has a car in it or not. Or I want a system that will recommend for me the top 5 movies that I haven't seen yet. What are the next 5 movies I should watch, right? If I define a particular task, almost every single machine learning system will display this diminishing returns curve, where you start with really low bad performance, and as you collect a little bit of data, you jump up, and then you cap off at the top. It's almost by definition, because you can't go above 100% accuracy or 0% error. And this is pretty important, because this diminishing returns curve is why when a company has data from 1 billion users, an individual person choosing to include their data or not include their data in that data set makes almost no difference. And in fact, there's a random chance that deleting your data could even make the system better if you're a little bit, you have odd taste compared to the average population. So it is true that data is only useful in aggregate, but also there's this diminishing returns when you look at a particular task. That gets more complicated if you define a pipeline of tasks or a suite of tasks, and you can get really complicated, and that's probably not useful to do, especially over audio. But yeah, I just want to add that in.
That's a really interesting point.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. That's a really interesting point about the science and mechanics of data science versus the economics of data science, as I understand it, right? Because, you want to encourage a better machine, right? Like a better predictive algorithm to do X, Y, and Z, unless it has other downside effects. That's a whole different conversation, right?
But relevant.
To kill us all versus one to cure cancer, right? But that's where you want the value added to come from, right? That's innovation. You don't want it to come from the fact that you're sitting on the nest egg, that you're sitting on all of this information that just keep getting updated, right? That's the network effect. It's not in the algorithm, right? Or it's not in the process you've designed. It's in the source for the process. And the great thing about data, right, from the point of view of a platform, right, is that if it's used, it's not like oil or something where it's burned up. You can just use it again over and over and over.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great business to be in some way, but it's not necessarily one that fosters a lot of innovation or gains.
I mean, I think that, Nick, you emphasized this idea that diminishing returns dynamic happens when you apply data to a particular task.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the key. That's the key. When we talk about the value of data, just open-ended, full stop, we're not talking about its value for a particular task. We're talking about its value for any task that we might apply it to. And I think that this is where the conversation often gets confusing. And I'd like to try to sort of draw out this distinction a bit more clearly, because the fact that data has diminishing returns to scale when applied to a particular task doesn't mean that it doesn't have increasing returns to scale economically overall, because the number of tasks that we might apply it to is huge, and it can actually increase. So, for example, if we compiled the data of lots and lots of people to try to train machine learning algorithm, or sorry, like a machine vision algorithm, is what I'm going to say. Eventually we will hit diminishing returns to scale in terms of improving the machine vision. But if we continue accruing data for this purpose, we might discover eventually that actually now there's something else we can do with it, right? We might be able to sort of pivot our business model away from machine vision and into some other area of inquiry or some other task that the data enables that we may not have even foreseen when we started compiling data for machine vision. And so this is where it gets complicated, and I think where the idea that data is an increasing return to scale process overall depends upon this idea that there is an indefinite number of tasks that we might apply it to.
Yeah.
The analogy I use to kind of clear that up in my head is the difference between like an electrical, steel press and the power grid, in that the steel press probably has diminishing returns, but we're not talking about the steel press here. We're talking about the power line that you have to plug it into, right?
Right.
And that usually doesn't have that much diminishing. I mean, there are some diminishing returns in electrical transmission, but not as much usually as, like the production of something, the cup or something that's sitting next to me, but it's a necessary input.
Yeah.
And one that has large scale effects.
I mean, another example, I think to try to create a concrete example of how data can do this, of how this happens in the context of data. Like you might imagine, suppose I had a social network that gathered information about where people like to shop in order to serve them ads about where they should shop, right? So then I get more and more data that helps me serve ads to them, to try to direct them to this shop or that shop. And it's a diminishing returns thing. Eventually, I've got so much data from so many people that my ability to improve this algorithm is decreasing. But at that point, I might discover that information reveals something completely different about all the people. It might reveal, so now I know more than I thought I knew. Now I also know their daily routines and I can geolocate them. And so now that I know their daily routines and geolocate them, I can not just serve them ads about where to shop, but I can give them incentives to do something completely different, or I can sell the data.
Yeah, you can sell their location to someone else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I can sell the location to, so in other words, there isn't like a clean distinction between the different purposes for which we might be collecting data. And that's where the increasing returns dynamics emerge.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so a couple other factors too that play a role in this apparent, I guess, what we have is kind of an apparent contradiction here, but it's actually not a contradiction at all.
Yeah.
Another factor is that the relationship between machine learning performance as it's measured by machine learning researchers and real world outcomes is not always one-to-one and is oftentimes unclear. So it's hard, you could tell me, I have this recommender system. It's going to recommend you where you should shop. And this version has 89% accuracy defined in terms of how often you send the recommendation and someone clicks it. That's insanely high, but let's just use it for the example. And then that's, system A has 89% accuracy and system B has 91% accuracy. It could be really hard for me to figure out how that 2% accuracy will actually translate in terms of long-term customer satisfaction, immediate sales, immediate changes to the user base. Are people going to tell? There's just a ton of n-order effects that go on here. So, and a big one is that if there's two online free services that you access via your web browser, and they're both quote unquote free, and one has quote unquote 99% accuracy and one has 98, I'll just pick the 99% every time. So there's this winner take all effect. The superstars have been talked about a lot in the context of the 21st century economy, and especially like tech firms. And I think like people like to use, this was in the Second Machine Age, a really popular book by Eric Brynjolfsson. The example of like Instagram starting with a really small number of employees and then getting bought out by Facebook for an absurd amount of money, which was just kind of like an unprecedented thing to happen. And yeah, I guess that's kind of an example of where now Instagram has this dominant position and it's really hard to beat them. So you can have these tasks, these machine learning tasks that have their diminishing returns in the context of a single task. And that's mainly relevant to how an individual or a group of people can affect the performance of a particular task. And it's not necessarily making any claims about the broader economic diminishing or increasing returns. So I think that's kind of like one way to resolve the contradiction and why they're important. And in terms of like what it means for data dividend, the natural monopoly increasing returns suggests kind of is a motivation for why there should even be state intervention in the first place. Whereas the diminishing returns of data for a single task tell us about, for instance, how much an individual might expect to get for their personal paycheck and why a personal paycheck would be really small and it's not necessarily the best use as opposed to funding public goods or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, just kind of a little bit of thinking out loud there in terms of how this is an apparent contradiction and how to resolve it.
No, yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and it picks up on that same theme of parts and wholes.
Yeah.
Right. So, if we look at a data set in terms of its ability to help us do a particular task, in a sense, we're looking at a part rather than the whole. The reality is that a data set that can help us serve more accurate ads for electronic sales might also be able to help us categorize people politically or socioeconomically, or in terms of sexual preferences, or any number of other things that someone might be willing to pay for, right? Anyway, that's a good transition maybe to the data dividends work. So I guess starting with Nick, would you like to tell us a little bit about the data dividends project that we worked on together, and how we went about it and what recommendations we make?
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess I have two helpful correctors if I make any errors available here. So the project, I guess, this began almost 2 years ago, or maybe even more than 2 years ago now. And the idea back then was that it was in response in 2019 in the State of the State speech, the governor of California had a line or two about a data dividend, which kind of led to a lot of speculation. There was a bunch of op-eds in the various California newspapers of what does this mean? What's a data dividend? And basically, we kind of digitally congregated a bunch of folks from academia, from industry, working in policy and think tanks and whatnot, who were all interested in this question. And we wanted to kind of sit down together virtually and try to figure that out. And what would a data dividend look like? What does it think like? So we kind of tasked ourselves as a ad hoc, non-political volunteer group to try to write a report answering what a data dividend for the state of California would look like. Do we think it would work best? Could we amass some basically recommendations? And so since then, we've been working on this report, and maybe I'll let you all expound on this. But the basic idea is it's a little bit of a rebrand. So a lot of people, when they hear data dividends, their immediate thought is, oh, I'm going to generate some data. I'm going to tap my phone and click my laptop and I'll get a paycheck because I generated that data. And while we're not like entirely saying that's impossible, we're recommending something a little different, which is a data dependence tax funded program for public goods. That's like a one sentence version. I don't know. Yakov, do you want to expand on that a little more?
Yeah, it's that plus using the tax as a way of restructuring the incentives and institutions of the system, right? Once you go like taxation isn't just about collecting revenues. It's about shaping, not even incentives, but asserting the power of the state over a economic sphere, right? Going back to Schumpeter. So the other thing we kind of built around this kind of tax, which is a tax not on as a way of individual remuneration, but as of a public goods building system, is ways of getting individual participation in there and collective participation. So one thing is using the tax to incentivize, consumer collectives that can decide whether they want to get remunerated for some parts of their data as a kind of block of consumers, what kind of privacy and conditions they can attach to the use of their data, right? In a vacuum, there's no reason for, like, say, Facebook to agree to that or want to work with that. If there is a tax attached to it that, gets discounted per se per user that accesses through one of these cooperatives, right? Be that they are well regulated, and Matt's thought a lot about this. Like, you're the guy who's really thought about the regulation part, right? Then Facebook might have an incentive to actually play ball and become a publicly kind of embedded corporation. The other aspect is we were really interested in, again, comes back to this idea of thinking of these as utilities, is to have what we call the Data Relations Board, which is something of an analog to the California Utilities Board, which was actually the first utilities board in the country, not the world, actually, right? To regulate the uses of data, but not only regulate them, but to make them a public kind of make them a public resource. So we think that there should be more and more public ownership of data through public data trusts, in which if there are publicly important data sets that are anonymous enough and that are secure enough, we think those should be administered by the public in the name of the public. And the tax helps get us there by, one, funding these things, right, and allowing us to collect that information in the name of the public, but two, also encouraging firms to put that kind of information into public domain through a tax incentive, right, to lower their tax. And that's really important because that is the utility part, right, of it all, right? It's the idea that because this has these scale effects we've been talking about, this is the kind of thing that publics need to control, because there's no way for this to be a quote unquote competitive market, right?
Yeah.
And we've had a long tradition, especially in America, of dealing with natural monopolies by making them into utilities rather than just breaking it up, because sometimes that's not feasible, right? There are places in which breaking up large firms works, right? Like the Facebook, Instagram thing, the classic example. But there are maybe some that it doesn't make sense, right? Because there's too much cross integration in production processes to make a breakup useful, rather than a kind of backdoor quasi nationalization, essentially, of the monopoly part of it.
Yeah. So the fundamental idea, if I'm glossing this correctly, is that there's this kind of spectrum between things that are sort of more suited for more private-like control and other things that are more suited for more public-like control.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's something that's happening in the sort of massive aggregation of data that pushes these big piles of aggregated data along that spectrum. So they start to look more like things that should have a public-like control.
Yes, that is a great way to put it. And not only is the tax revenue raising, which is good, states especially, because they don't have a printing press and need a lot of revenue, right? Especially California, because we have Proposition 13, which lets us not tax land, which makes life very difficult, and it's very regressive. But that's one part, but it's also it's almost like, putting a flag down that this isn't the Wild West, that value is somehow can't come out of nowhere, that private actors can't be the only ones who set value here. The public can't. And that's right. Actually a deeper, more important, I think, function of taxation and revenue raising.
And I think this again goes back to that sort of part and whole thing. In other words, so if we sort of track onto the metaphor a little bit further, the sorts of things that are more suited to more private-like control tend to be things that are more divisible, right? Assets, they can be sort of divided into a million pieces and managed independently without harm to the value or the utility of the whole, right? Whereas the sorts of massive data sets that are driving the big tech platforms and much of the cutting edge AI and modern economy in general tend to be things that that can't be, these data sets can't just be sort of fragmented into a million pieces without destroying their potential for good or for ill, which means that there should be a stronger measure of public control and sort of shared participation in the value that they create, right?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd also add I think that maybe my own fault. I've been talking about like machine learning and AI specifically a lot, but this really applies to. It's not just tech companies that are benefiting from this socially produced data. It's basically literally any large firm they probably have a team of data scientists, but they probably have some position in their firm, maybe business analysts, et cetera, that is benefiting from data. Of course, the tech companies and people who are actually doing the cutting edge AI research might be benefiting even more, but it's not just only tech companies and AI we're talking about. And I'm saying that because it's my own fault. I tend to overly fixate on like kind of viewing these things through a lens of machine learning loss functions and using research methods and framing everything in terms of counterfactual questions about machine learning models. But that's actually a bit too limited. So I want to walk back on my own limitedness.
That's a really important caveat along thinking about the tax, right? Because I think we've, done a good job on, and particularly your colleague Han Lin, I think has been, and also our colleagues Han Lin and Louisa, who are in different time zones, so can't join us right now, have really done like the work showing is we can design a data dependence tax that taxes, a tech firm at a much higher rate than like a company that, makes toilet paper. I don't know why that was my first thought, because that's a deficit item these days. And uses that data to try to project where to send their supplies, right? Because they're not really dependent on that data. They're not storing as much of a vast amount of it. And that means you can tier it, right? And as the experiments run by our colleagues have shown, those tiers are actually pretty good at saying that, Downey isn't going to fall under a data dependence tax to any large extent, but Facebook, whose entire business model is based on that, is going to fall under that, which I think is really gets this distinction that you made about the collective value of data and its reusability and its kind of constant malleability to create more and more value, even though individual processes get diminishing returns. And, companies that still use data, who doesn't, right, but aren't really dependent on it for their business model. Yeah. So could you summarize that a little bit more, Yakov, in terms of, this data dependence tax idea is close to the core of the proposal of the data dividends idea. And can you say a little bit more about what that means? So what we're looking at is actually, there are really two separate taxes in our recommendation, right? The first one is extremely straightforward, which is just a transaction tax on data broker companies, right? Companies that sell data to other companies or buy data from companies, right? That's just a straightforward sales tax, essentially, right? The more complex one is the one on data storage, right? And the storage of individual identifiable users. So we've actually kind of played with the definition a bit. And here, this California Data Protection Act, the CCPA, is actually pretty good at what we found, getting that is it's not just registered users, but they're a larger network to the point where a user can be identified as an individual. That's the thing we're taxing, right? But we're not taxing it on a one-to-one basis. We are making a cutout for company size and revenue, right? And we're also making cutouts for the amount. We're making like a marginal tier. Like we're taxing this on the marginal user. So there's like a nice little tier kind of going through, right, on how many users you get. So again,
so basically the tax tries to it tries to create a higher tax for very big companies whose business model depends upon the aggregation of data pertaining to many, many people.
Yes, exactly, right? Rather than a smaller company or a large company that's only incidentally using data to optimize one or two processes that it's doing, right? Which is, we want to encourage that, really, not, tax that.
Right. And actually, I think there's another interesting possible misunderstanding about the sort of thrust or intention of the data dividends idea here, which is which relates to what we were just talking about in the sense of sort of public control. So when you hear about a tax like this, that taxes a certain kind of business model more than another, you might, if you kind of have taken, if you're sort of versed in Econ 101 or something, you might think of that as like a Pigovian tax. In other words, a tax meant to discourage a kind of thing that we don't want people to be doing, like a cigarette tax or something like that. But I think that what we're aiming at is actually a little deeper, a little more subtle than a sin tax like that. We're not saying that the idea behind a data dependence tax isn't that it's bad to create big data dependent businesses. It's just that those types of businesses more resemble things that the public ought to have a stake in, and that the public ought to have a measure of control over. So in other words, it's not about taxing data-dependent businesses because we just want everyone to use pen and paper and not get the benefits of modern technology. It's that these kind of business models just demand a greater sort of public stake.
And I love your phrasing on that, by the way, because the control and the stake word are just not used enough now in economic policy, right? They used to be public control, not necessarily public ownership, but this idea that the public should have some control in some private activities is actually a founding part of American economic policy going back to the founding generation, to Alexander Hamilton's writing, and even Thomas Jefferson's writing, right? And we usually think as opposed to things. And it really does run through all the way really up through the 60s, that public control over certain key elements that are really embedded within society is considered a goal of policy. And we don't really talk about it that way anymore, but I think that's an important thing.
So, Yakov, you probably know more about this than I do, but Keynes was interested in an older idea about ethics, stemming from like G.E. Moore, these kind of like turn of the century ethicists about, which goes under the name organic unities. So there's a sort of idea of organicism.
I wish I knew more about this.
Yeah, so
I've heard of it too, but I know the exact person. If you're interested in telling, who's been like reading up on this. But
I would love to. It's just something that I'm sort of starting to explore as well, to sort of figure out what Keynes was interested in here and how it relates to what we're talking about.
That's definitely like Zach Carter's new book, and even more so my friend Alex Williams, who's like just doing. I'm going to plug up like a deep chapter a month dive into the general theory of like reading it as a philosophical text, but yeah, it is a very different way of doing economics than what we're used to, and this is an area that I do work on, right? Like the history of economic thought. Economics wasn't always about like solving an optimization problem.
Right. And just to set it up for the listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about, this idea of organic unities has to do with the idea of increasing returns and the idea that parts can be greater than their wholes. So in other words, there can be sort of institutional and social structures in society that add up to more than the sum of their parts, and that therefore ought to be cultivated and so on. Keynes didn't actually write very much about this, but he was heavily influenced by this way of thinking. And I think it's a really useful lens through which to understand his appreciation of the importance of the role of government in society.
And if you really want to push on the sideline, actually, if you look through what Keynesian theory is, which is about essentially why the entire Keynesian project in the general theory is disproving Say's law, which is that supply makes its own demand through rational decisions in a variety of more complex ways. It reveals more and more about how a modern economy works. It's really just it really is just like, if you actually read the book, it's an extremely catty book. He's just teeing off against this one assumption in more complex and beautiful ways. But what he's trying to get at is that outcomes that are individually rational are collectively irrational and imperfect.
Right.
And that's why you can, in the context that he's writing in the Great Depression, the argument is this could all be solved by wages falling. And he's showing no, actually it won't, because that's individually rational, but as a collective unity that actually makes the situation even worse, because who's going to buy the output then? And then why would you hire people? I mean, that's like a very vulgar Keynesian a summary of the book, but that's what he's trying to do. And he makes that point in far more complicated ways, introducing financial instruments, introducing a philosophy of uncertainty, et cetera, right? To explain why that happens. But yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I do think Keynes is not a quote unquote modern economist. He's closer to the institutionalist in some ways. And that's why he's great to read compared to, like Ransky's textbook or something that you read these days. There's just not that kind of deep philosophical engagement there in the discipline anymore. I wish there was. Most you get Karl Popper, some people reading Popper and just citing that's over.
Right. And then Keynes's disciple, John Kenneth Galbraith, sort of carries forward some of that.
Yeah, and then through that, you also slightly on the edge Keynes, and you get the Keynes Schumpeter fusions within the American post-Keynes, the Minsky's, the Weintraubs, etc., which are influenced again by the American institutionalists who we were talking about earlier, who are very interested in these structures and instabilities within the accumulation process.
Right. So I think the theme here is basically that there's we've kind of stumbled into a place in our policy thinking, in our thinking about data, and our thinking about economics, our thinking about policy in general, where we kind of missed forest for the trees, basically. Right? We're trying to formalize things in terms of their particular application or in terms of a particular way of understanding their value without seeing the way that they fit together into a broader whole. At least my kind of interpretation of what's happened over the past 10 years or so with the data economy is just that it's, these new technologies have connected us so much more intimately that the untenability of this has become very apparent. It's becoming clearer that we need to look at things as organic wholes, as G.E. Moore might have put it, instead of as discrete parts with their own separate valuations that can sort of move independently of one another.
Yeah.
Nick, what are your thoughts? Maybe we can turn back to the question of different kinds of data, like data that isn't collected from people per se, or
okay. So I got a little lost with the economic history there. I'm not going to lie. But I was kind of thinking of a bit of like a thought experiment that I think will be hopefully pretty quick and helpful. Which is that if you imagine a village somewhere on Earth in the pre-internet era, and there's a store in the middle of the village, and there's a guy with a really good memory who likes to sit in the store and memorize what everyone buys. And then he goes to people's houses and offers them special deals on the stuff that he remembers that they like to buy. So I like to buy milk. So he comes to my house and tries to give me a deal on milk. And that's how he makes money. Basically, I'm trying to, imagine a human recommender system who is basically making money off of data from all the people in the town, just watching them. And there's no technology here. There's literally no internet, no electricity here. The underlying arguments that we use to justify this data dividends proposal could be used to justify taxing this one guy, or basically saying, hey, buddy, you're making money off of the preferences and the lives and activities of everyone in this town. You should pay it into a public good somehow. And in a sense, that's done through taxes. So the reason I think that's a useful thought experiment is because the same thing is happening now. It's just super, super, supercharged by tech companies and large firms more generally who are able to collect data, because one person can only memorize so many preferences, and the scale that we're doing it on now is just completely insane. And the reason that story is also useful is because when we first talk about data, or when I say your data is fueling AI systems, which is something I say a lot. I start a lot of my talks with it, and it's a kind of a point I return to a lot in my research. It's easy to think you might say, okay, give me an example. And I would say, well, did you know that Wikipedia is used as training data in tons of natural language processing research and graph research, for instance, because of the knowledge graph that underlies Wikipedia. It appears all the time in search engines. Like if you search for anything with a Wikipedia page, you'll almost always get the Wikipedia page as one of the top results. So if you're a Wikipedia editor, that means that you help fuel AI. You help fuel hundreds of AI research papers, for instance. And you might say, okay, that's cool. I see that. I can see how sitting down and writing a Wikipedia article is like doing a job. I can see how I'm kind of a laborer in a sense who worked for the tech company to help produce this awesome AI system. But I'm not a Wikipedia editor, so maybe I'm not included in this. And I guess the point is that now because we've commodified literally almost every interaction from the moment you wake up until you go to sleep, if depending on how networked, how digitally connected you are, that is not the only kind of data fueling AI systems. And in fact, it's maybe easier to study in some cases. Wikipedia is really great to study because it's all open. But just the fact that you like milk is going to help the equivalent, the digital supercharged order of magnitudes bigger version of the guy memorizing everyone's favorite stuff at the store, is going to help these tech companies sell more milk to other people like you, just by going through your daily activities. So the public collectively has basically become these data laborers, and really anything that can be recorded into a CSV file or some other whatever database file format company is using can and will be used to train models to make profits. And if we don't have some mechanism to return that, or to help fund public goods, or make those benefits shared more widely, what's going to happen is just the concentration of power. And this is kind of there's a dystopian, people kind of have this talk about this dystopian vision of the streets are empty and literally no one has a job and robots are doing absolutely everything. And there's a lot of science fiction about this. So I won't, describe that right now, but there's also kind of a shorter term, in the next 5 years or so, that economic inequality just continues to grow. And there's tons of negative effects of that. And so that's kind of the motivation for why we have to do something. And just to return that back, so I think that the corner store or the village store milk story thought experiment is a nice example of why it's not just about data that you produce. It's the fact that you went to the hospital and got a brain scan. Whether you like it or not, you might be in a study now. Medicine's actually a little interesting because they're a little bit better. In some senses, there's been a lot of big ethical debates in the field, and there's been a lot of really bad ethical malpractice in medicine. So it's discussed more prominently. And now I think hospitals are, let me put it this way. You're more likely to get asked for consent to appear in a medical study than you are to appear in a tech company's recommender system. I think I can stand by that. But nonetheless, basically, just the fact that you went to the hospital, you're going to help fueling it. You're going to end up help fueling some AI technology somewhere, and that's why you should be seeing some of the gains. And the way to do it in the short term is probably to contribute to public goods.
Yeah, I mean, and the interesting thing also is whether consent is enough. Because the main difference, it seems to me, or one of the main differences between the shopkeeper recommender and like a modern system is the winner take all dynamics of it.
Yeah.
So in a shop in a village a long time ago, you could have a bunch of different shopkeepers who are recommending things to people, and some might be a little bit better than the others, but that if one was a little bit better than the next, then that wouldn't put the second one out of business. Everybody wouldn't flock to the first one, right? So what that suggests to me is that the gains from the systems need to be distributed totally independently of whether there is consent or not. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Like if you take, or instead of giving an example, let me ask you a question. Like, what do you think about GPT-3 or something like that? OpenAI, for example. If we have AI systems that are extremely data dependent, that are open to be used by anyone in the public, do you think that's less of a problem, or do you think that solves the problem?
Okay, yeah, that's a really great question. So also, I do want to comment on GPT-3 a little bit, because that's a really interesting one. So I actually wrote a blog post about that paper, about the system, because it got so much prominence, and it is literally trained on Wikipedia and Reddit. There's some other stuff in there too. So there's the Common Crawl, which is basically like the internet, all of the internet you can scrape with a bot. And there's a big data set of books, so published authors. But there's a really good chance, if you're listening, that you helped to train GPT-3. And it's also a really interesting one because there's a pretty good case to be made that that's a system that might end up causing more harm than it does help people, in terms of like replicating harmful language that's found on the internet, because of course there's a lot of toxicity and hateful speech on places like Reddit, and it's hard to clean that out when you're basically training a model on all of the internet.
Didn't one of the bots become a Nazi within like an hour or something like that?
Yeah, so that was years ago. That was Microsoft's Tay. That's like a classic example in kind of like AI gone wrong talks. Everyone loves that one. And that was a long time ago. And yeah, it hasn't gotten a lot better. There's kind of a whole separate discussion to be had about when a system is deemed societally harmful or not. But GPT-3 is one that might be harmful. Nonetheless, it's gonna make companies money. Companies are gonna make lots of money off language models. I think no one will argue with that. And these language models are being trained by the text we all wrote. That's the way if you want to train a giant language model, you want to see what are all the ways that people write. And you're basically telling your machine to look at all the ways that people write and write like that. And doing it with a lot of parameters and a lot of money on compute and just, training, chugging on your weights. So that's it's a perfect example. It's a indisputable example of your data that you consciously contributed is going to help tech companies make money, and it might harm people in the process. What do we do about it? So now is democratization the answer?
But I can just download. It's open source, right? I mean, I can just.
No. Sorry. This is not a huge controversy. It's become a little controversial that the OpenAI actually did this thing with GPT-2, the previous one, and had a big press release saying this model is too dangerous to release because it's going to be, the spammers are going to use it starting tomorrow and start producing like the most authentic looking spam ever. And so we're not going to release it. And people got on the internet and said, ha, OpenAI, not so open anymore, etc. And that's basically still true. So I don't know if it actually matters, because the truth of it is that these models are so big that the capital required to operate them is just enormous. So even if they made everything open source, you wouldn't be able to. We can't train our own version of GPT-3 on my laptop or even on my school server cluster. It just costs so much money. So there's a really interesting dynamic going on there too, with the data that they're using is actually primarily commons data and not proprietary data like search engines and recommender systems are using. But on the other hand, it's the just enormous cost of capital and getting the engineers to hook all the things, to duct tape everything together properly is really tough. So basically, they could release an API, they can make a free API, that'd be really expensive, or it would cost them a lot of money, and basically let anyone log in and just kind of produce text using prompts. And right now, I think their plan is they're partnering with Microsoft to kind of make that available as a paid service. So I think that also maybe got some internet laughs.
The upshot, though, is essentially that even if this were open source, or even if it was an API that anybody could access, it would still essentially concentrate power in the hands of well-capitalized parties who are best positioned to apply it to a problem.
Yes.
So, Nick, could I ask you a question then? Yeah. What are the exact inputs that are so capital intensive? Is it just servers and manpower, essentially, like engineer time?
So it's engineer and compute. So the thing here is basically like a really crude example. I don't really remember about the architecture of GPT-3 off the top of my head, but basically what it's doing is it's reading everything on the internet and then updating a bunch of model weights. Sometimes people will say like deep learning can be crudely described as just stacking linear regression on top of each other and just keep stacking it until you can't anymore. That is a little crude, and it kind of maybe downplays the degree of innovation that's gone on in terms of like clever optimization tricks and clever architecture tricks and different ways to hook different weights together that will give you better outputs.
Everything can be a linear regression in this most raw.
Yeah, but basically, it's the cost of electricity and computer access, and just like the models are so big, there's so many parameters that even like hooking up the like computing infrastructure is challenging. I think there's tons of authors on the paper, and there's like a gazillion more people in the acknowledgements, because it's just such a monumental task to even, do the nuts and bolts of this, basically.
I mean, that's really interesting, because that really sinks back this quote unquote data economy right back into the real economy, right?
Yeah.
Into real physical stuff, right? Because it's not like this stuff is now costless, like, or low capital cost, like the data. You really need stuff to operate it, right? And that brings us back to the realm of stuff we really easily understand, like hurdle rates, CapEx, all that stuff that like you just do day to day.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking up. So the estimates, I think there's an estimate of around, this is from Lambda Labs, which is a GPU company. They offer GPU services, and they estimated it at $4.6 million to train at one time. And of course, a thing that critics have pointed out is that when language changes, like if a new social movement enters the vernacular, or people, new memes come out, you have to train it again. So there's kind of an interesting side thing about the notion of like data going stale, and how long your data remains good for. That also can increase the capital requirements of these kind of things.
And there's also a winner-take-all dynamic here too, right? Because if everyone had their own GPT-3 instance, and even if we could all, let's say the price of training it goes way, way down so that everybody can train their own GPT-3, it'll still be the case that whoever has the best one, whoever has the best GPT-3 trained on the most recent data on the largest data set, will be able to fool the other ones, essentially.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And another aspect too is that to actually like make money off of this, you're going to need the scale. Basically you'll need all the resources a business needs to operate in the first place, because there's been a lot of things that are proposed to do with language models. So you can, automate what was previously thought to be deep work, like writing autocomplete a report. People have done some pretty cool stuff in terms of like getting it to write web pages and like do design work. And you can type in like make two red boxes next to each other, and it will create the HTML and CSS code, the web code for that. And so basically, if I'm just an individual, if I had my own instance somehow and someone gave me, I magically got $4.6 million, I wouldn't be able to do, I don't know what I would actually do with the model even. Whereas if I was running a firm, there's probably a lot of things I could do with it.
Right.
And so this is kind of a whole side topic about the role of automation in the concentration of power, and then also the role of automation in like transforming the economy, which I don't want to make any claims there.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, one of the things that all this draws out for me, and I'm curious what you think about this, Nick, is that it seems that the whole sort of logic and the logic of open source and open data and so on just seems to be breaking down. It just seems to be reaching its limit as a strategy for genuinely, distributing control over important systems and giving more people access to economic value. It just seems to be reaching its apotheosis. Am I wrong about that?
I mostly agree. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. I don't have like a super strong take on this. Like an interesting observation is that machine learning research, people talk a lot about like reproducibility crisis in science. Machine learning research is actually some of the best. Like people really do some crazy stuff with making their code actually runnable. And it's still a big problem. And there's been some pretty shocking papers where folks will go back and try to reproduce all of the top papers from like the last 3 years of top conferences. And then they'll find out only 20% of them shared their code, and only 50% of the authors will respond when you ask for their code and stuff like that. But it's still really good. And part of that is driven by the fact that the big tech companies have done a great job of open sourcing some of the software. So the big machine learning libraries are TensorFlow and PyTorch, and those are supported by Google and Facebook and open source contributors.
No. So I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't get me wrong. I've been speaking the language of open source and open data and so on for a long time, and I absolutely agree that it has created enormous value that would otherwise just be gummed up in the Bell Labs or whatever. But I think that when you look at these edge cases, about, like GPT-3, like the sort of, the cutting edge sort of data value extraction systems, you are starting to see, I think, where the logic of open breaks down and where a more sort of thoughtful and complex institution building approach to sharing value is going to be required. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally agree. I guess so. One thing I would add is that yes, all the open source is really good and impressive, but so I guess here's like a little a fun story that relates to this, which is that since I've started thinking about this topic a lot, something I try to do in a variety of spaces that have a lot of people who are interested in data and machine learning stuff is ask people how often they actually use their own models in their own life. Like, okay, so the cutting edge, I could in theory download the absolute best like mathematical code for updating my model weights for some kind of model and apply it to making a recommender system for my own life where I recommend what if I should get a dark roast coffee or a light roast coffee each morning. Right? In theory, I could do that. The tools are all there. It would be really easy. There's these amazing READMEs that would help me install the latest software and format my data correctly, and I could do it. I guess that's kind of a silly task because that's more of a signal processing task than it's not really like any sort of tough recommendation, or it's just a pattern matching task, but I could do it. And basically no one's doing this as far as I can tell. If anyone is listening and they do this, I'd be really curious. Please let me know what you're doing. I'm dying to know. But that relates to the fact that most of these systems are only useful when in collaboration. Oh, sorry, what was that?
I think that person might be slightly insane too, but also interesting to talk to.
Well, maybe. I mean, yeah. I am dying to know. But ultimately, it's only these systems are valuable because they're connecting us, right? there is like maybe this very grand philosophical, beautiful interpretation of like even the most gross, ugly, unethical targeted ad system that's like, sending people, tricking people into buying bad products and whatnot. The model, like the weights underlying that model, are this tapestry representing collective human experience. And that's the thing that's useful. And me just trying to figure out what type of coffee I should have in the morning to optimize my happiness, which is maybe, perhaps a silly task in the first place, is not useful.
Right. And again, that's about the combination of information between people, right? It's about and sort of the social.
So to connect that back, the open source movement is awesome, is like an amazing example of collective action. Like the actual production of code artifacts is collective action. And there's tons of amazing collective action literature on the topic. For instance, like around Linux and everything related to Linux. But I think there is somewhat of there's some individualist like mindsets underlying it in some cases, like the idea of building your reputation and becoming a contributor and whatnot. And to use these technologies, you need institutions and you need ways to manage, you need to manage the fact that you're getting data from a bunch of people, which is tough. Why would people trust? If I want to start a recommender system tomorrow, why would anyone trust me with their data about what coffee they like? And so that's why you need institutions, or that's one reason why.
I think that's a great way of thinking about it. It's almost like you can imagine it almost like a garden that needs a gardener or something, right? In other words, you can, by keeping things open, you can create more activity, more sort of cross-pollination and invention. But there is, at some point, public concerns come into the picture that need to be addressed through, not necessarily through government, but through some kind of institutional framework that doesn't quite fit into the rubric of software collaboration.
I have a new metaphor. Can I workshop it? You just inspired it. So when people talk about open source solving the problem or open data solving the problem, they're kind of suggesting everyone just kind of, let's say that the benefits of AI are fruits and vegetables in this case. And the powers that be are suggesting everyone should just have their own garden, just have a garden on your balcony. But the problem is that we all live in tiny, urban, densely packed environments. And the best we can do is grow one vegetable every 2 weeks, which is not enough to sustain us. Like the conditions of modernity have put us into this state, and instead we should band together and have farms. There's something there. I'll workshop that a little more. I think there's a good metaphor. There's maybe a presentation slide there or something.
I think that's actually a great metaphor, and it only makes the need to control and to like really embed and understand this economy even more dire. Like when you said that 4.7 million, what was it, per instance number, that was jaw dropping, because that means that makes entrants more and more and more powerful, and especially ones that have already accumulated via sitting on these stacks of data possibly. And that really cries out for some kind of scaling of something like a data industrial policy. I think we've been playing with that word before. We never really defined what that is. But, if this is a huge driver of economic activity, there really does need to be some thought. And this is actually my wheelhouse. This is like what I was trained around and work on, right? Is some kind of set of public investments into building an infrastructure, right? Because those are huge hurdle rates, possibly. Those are massive. The goal of industrial policy is to figure out where and how those can be overcome. There are many arguments for it, from national interests, right, to like equity, to economic growth. This stuff isn't just what this process of working with you guys has kind of made me realize, that this stuff really, really isn't costless. we need to think about how not only the distributional problems on one hand, but the actual, what are the uses and facilitations of this and the other, right? It's not just output. Like the input itself is really hard to think about. And I think we've only begun to think about that problem. Like just realize it, acknowledging it is already a huge step.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I agree as well. And I think that a sort of understanding is emerging that we need to make really big decisions about the direction of our society, in this space, in this area of how we handle data and what it's used for, and the idea of allowing these decisions to emerge through the logic of atomized individuals following economic incentives just isn't going to work out.
The economic incentive themselves are in the eyes of the beholder. They're never not rooted in the larger whole. I love this kind of language you use.
So what else should we talk about? What else is on your guys' minds in connection with this conversation that we could explore for a few minutes?
Still can't get over the fact that it costs $4.7 million per instance of CapEx to get a result out of this supposedly free process.
Yeah. So let me just clarify that. So that in theory, you only have to train it once per round for how long you think it's good for. So once you're done, now you have your weights are all set and you can give it a prompt. You can say, I'm going to go to and it will, using all the text on the internet ever, say the most likely thing is I'm going to go to the store and buy beer. That's probably not it, but, and you can do that forever. Now you can do that infinitely many times until you decide that you're too out of date and you need to try it again. I had some notes here, but also I have a bunch of new thoughts from this conversation. Oh, one thing that I guess isn't maybe an interesting thing to talk about is like how would we move towards something like data dividends or data industrial policy or data co-ops.
Yeah, and we talk about data leverage a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can just give a little background there.
Let me set it up for the
sake of for sure.
Stitching this together, and then that's perfect. So we went through this process as a working group, putting together a data dividends proposal with great colleagues, including Han-Lin Lee, Brent Hecht, Louisa Scarcella, and Chirag Lala, which kind of represents an actionable policy that could start to move in this direction, move into the direction of a rational data industrial policy, or a way of giving the public a stake in the data economy. But there are lots of other interesting ideas out there about how to move towards that. Some of which you've outlined in some great recent research, Nick. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really super connected, which is great. So in some of the recent work, we've focused on this concept called data leverage. And the core idea is that a group of people, well, it's really, the core idea is the same as data dividends, which is that the public and society broadly are responsible for the success of AI because they play a role in producing the data that trains it and fuels it. And also that applies to other data-driven technologies. And so because we're responsible for that, that means that there's a lot of ways that the public could basically change the performance. So if myself and a group of my friends are mad at a tech company because of something they've done, we could basically just say we're going to stop using that platform, cut off our data contributions to them, and make their AI system worse. And so we've conceptualized this as a data strike because we were doing data labor before, and when you withhold your labor, that's a strike. So withholding your data labor is a data strike. And there's other versions too. So we could give companies bad data, and that would be data poisoning. So I'd lie to a recommender system. I go on YouTube and I queue up a music video I hate to try to trick YouTube into recommending that music video to other people like me out there in the world. And then a third data lever, as we've conceptualized it, is called conscious data contribution. And that's where I basically take my data and give it to a competitor and say, hey, I really want you to be able to compete with this company that I dislike their practices. Here's a bunch of data. Hopefully this helps your AI systems get better. So there's all these ways that because AI is reliant on data contributions from the public, that we can basically change their outcomes. And this has always been true. So it's not like this has changed. This is like a new thing that's happening in 2020. And in fact, in the past, social movements that involve protesting or boycotting, like Facebook, for instance, has been the target of some boycotts. These things would also have the effect of changing how their AI systems work and maybe lowering the accuracy of ad targeting, for instance. But it's something that we think in the future that can be enhanced. And there's a really great opportunity for researchers in machine learning, researchers in the social sciences and in design and human-computer interaction, and policymakers to kind of have this coalition. So for instance, there's great opportunities to build tools that make it easy to kind of join these things, because the big advantage is that like striking is quite hard to organize, but data strikes are actually quite easy to join. I can just basically I could delete my YouTube account and start only using YouTube from a Mozilla container browser, which tries to do a bunch of stuff for anti-tracking. I could very easily switch platforms. I can just, use a new search engine perhaps. This is a bit harder for social networks because there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to leave a social network, but there's kind of in-between options, right? I can continue to message my family members on Facebook, but stop clicking their ads if I used to click their ads, for instance, or stop using their friend recommendations. So there's a lot of in-betweens. There's a lot of ways that people can start exerting data leverage. And if done collectively, it could be really effective. I wanted to bring this up. I feel a little bad about doing it, but I can't help myself. We've recently seen this, like, one of the biggest examples of online collective action ever, I think, in terms of GameStop and Wall Street Bets on Reddit. The amount of traffic on Reddit is actually on like Wall Street Bets is pretty wild. The rhetoric is all framed around collective action, which is really interesting. And yeah, I don't know. It looks like you might have some thoughts on this, Yakov.
But God, no. I mean, this is a really difficult ethical question because, like, the rhetoric is, I think, insane.
Yeah.
For what is a classical boiler room scheme pump and dump, and like as we speak, I'm seeing people posting that stock is collapsing and people are losing their entire life savings.
Yeah, so I'm definitely not trying to promote this or make any sort of recommendations, but it is an example of massive online collective action organized through an online platform like Reddit. And this, you could basically imagine something like this happening around trying to bring down a new AI technology that people are really mad about, or trying to support a new AI business that people really like.
That requires, like, there's a political there, right? Because the whole thing is what a lot of people in the industry that I know who are, let's just put it, extremely left-leaning are really worried that people are using very good critiques of the financial industry to get rich off of people who don't know better.
Yeah.
And so the question is, it comes back to institutions, right? And why we need institutions, that spontaneous action can let really, really bad actors in to really hurt large amounts of people. And that's kind of why you need some kind of, like union with, or something like that can, like a data co-op that can really guide this kind of action rather than, and have some like fiduciary responsibility to members rather than, some guy screaming short to screw the hedge funds where there might actually be more hedge funds on the long side,
Yeah.
using you to squeeze the shorts and then get very, very rich.
Yeah. And this actually also relates to the dangers of data leverage. So data leverage, the topic of people trying to fool machine learning systems has been studied for a long time under the lens of security, not under the lens of using this as a way of addressing economic inequality, but of let's make sure our machine learning systems don't get hacked basically by bad training data. And so this is going to be a concern for data leverage too. But to bring it all back together, basically, so there's other examples. So for instance, the book #Activism describes a lot of recent campaigns around like social justice topics that were pretty successful at spreading their message through decentralized action on Twitter without formal leaders, and without having any. Basically, a lot of the individuals participating did so at really low cost to themselves. And there's a lot of discourse in the literature about this that people have a variety of takes, but I think there's strong evidence that online collective action is possible. There's indisputable evidence that online collective action is possible, and strong evidence that it can be done around political topics. And so data leverage is one way that the public might advocate for something like a data dividend, where maybe, so we did try to set up our proposal has a lot of stuff that is trying to make this not painful. So to give companies ways to get tax breaks, to make it so companies aren't disincentivized from gaining new users, to make sure we're not stifling innovation. That's like one of our core principles that we really stuck to from the beginning, to avoid complexity, not create a bunch of loopholes. So there's a bunch of reasons why companies, we tried to not make this horrible on companies, but obviously there's still going to be some resistance, and ultimately firms are, the people in power at firms are going to make decisions economically. And so data leverage is a way that the public could say, hey, unless you go along with something that gives me, if you don't fund some public goods or give me some of my value back, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to continue helping you make these insanely profitable AI technologies. So that's how it all connects together, to try to tie the knot there.
Yeah. So I think that, so another piece of background here is that Radical Exchange Foundation has also done some research on the sort of institutional framework for data cooperatives or data coalitions that would create sort of a legal, regulated kind of intermediary that would mediate the relationship between regular people and data dependent businesses and other entities. And part of the reason behind that is along the lines of what Yakov was saying is that it's possible to imagine these kinds of intermediaries themselves becoming exploitative. So they would need to, so there's good reasons to think about how to impose the right kinds of duties on them and the right kinds of requirements of independence on them and things like that. And there's interesting conversations going on around that sort of thing in the European Union, which is taking steps to create something like these kinds of intermediaries through something called the Data Governance Act. The Data Governance Act may or may not end up being a great thing. The devil's in the details, and I think time will tell. But pending the establishment of a sort of a well-regulated network of intermediaries that can represent people's data interests in their lives, there is this question of what can we do to organize to either push the world in this direction a little bit or start to rebalance the power situation between ourselves and big platforms. And I think that your work on data leverage is articulating ways of doing that, articulating ways that we could think about what a data coalition or a data cooperative might be able to do now without some new regulatory framework formalizing its power. So I think it's super interesting. Basically, it's really interesting to think about the possibilities if people did organize and coordinate their behavior in this kind of informal way, so that you could imagine large numbers of people providing really valuable data to companies that made certain promises about how they would use it or something, or you could imagine people. You could imagine a cooperative like this kind of doing the legal research and doing the hard work to figure out where the legal lines are in terms of data poisoning, and what can we do to sort of confound platforms in terms of the quality of the data that they're receiving, in order to try to inspire them to agree to agree to use their data in a better way or something like that. And, as you say, the idea of withdrawing data, so the third sort of category of data leverage, which is like a data strike, that does seem to me to be harder to organize informally. I mean, it's notoriously hard to get everyone to pull themselves out of a network that they're already embedded in, basically. But so that one actually, I guess I'm a little less optimistic about sort of data strikes happening without some kind of coordinated, more robust system of coordination. But data poisoning and active data contribution do seem like really promising levers that we should be experimenting with.
Yeah. So I'll add. So we have a paper out. There's a preprint on Archive now. It's called Data Leverage, a framework for empowering the public in its relationship with technology companies. That's right. And we talk about how all these three different levers are strong and not strong in different circumstances and how they might be used. And one thing that I guess I'll pitch for the listeners is that there's exciting opportunities for everyone here. So as just a individual interested in the space, there's ways that you could try to start exerting data leverage now, in the sense that you can choose which AI technologies you are contributing to or not contributing to. Depending on where you live, your government may help you do that more or less. So the more kind of data protection regulation that you have, the easier it will be for you to do that. But for machine learning researchers, there's a ton of really awesome opportunities to basically the research on explanatory models. So like doing questions about how would the model perform in this alternate situation are inherently about data leverage. So if I take a classic learning curve where I train my model with 10% of the data, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, I basically want to see how my performance scales with the data set size, the training data size. That's basically, each time I rerun it, I'm simulating a new data strike. If I know, how my performance is at 70%, that tells me how effective it would be if 30% of the users got together and did a data strike. It also tells me how effective it would be if 70% of the users got together and engaged in a conscious data contribution campaign. So there's tons of this in the machine learning literature already. But basically, the more we know about models, and like I said, machine learning academics are awesome in terms of making really great, easy to like visualizations, for instance, and public resources on the research. The more we do that, the easier it will be to reason about how effective data leverage can be. And then for like designers and people on the web design side and on the tool side, there's just a ton of opportunities to build browser extensions, for instance, that help that kind of automate the process, because obviously no one wants to sit down and and go through a list of 50 companies and decide which ones am I going to contribute data today and which ones am I not going to. In the future, ideally, that would be probably done by an intermediary, a data co-op. But even in the short term, there's potential for software and tools to help take some of that cognitive load away. That's what software is great for. So, and then also, I'd love to talk to you about this sometime, Matt. The legal side of this is really interesting too. And I'm sure there's a bunch of nuance there and tons of research to be done. So really exciting. I really think I've been talking to my advisor, Brent Hecht, used this really nice analogy that we think that data leverage is a giant tent and all the sides are open. We really think all the sides are open. Like everyone has something to gain here. And we're excited about that aspect of the work a lot.
So if we do manage to steer our cruise ship in the right direction and institute things like data dividends policies or the sort of Data Freedom Act, data coalitions stuff, or we manage to organize people felicitously into data leverage campaigns. If we manage to establish more kind of shared control over this gigantic shared asset that is powering the contemporary economy and contemporary life, what is it going to look like 10 years from now? In other words, what kind of problems is it realistic to imagine we might solve? Are we going to have a healthier public discourse? Are we going to be able to solve the sorts of speech problems that Twitter and Facebook have been dealing with recently? Are we going to have a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. What's the end game here? Where do we want to be in 10 years? And what's the vision that we need to communicate to a broader public to convince, millions and millions of people that with everything else going on in the world, this is a topic that we all need to be engaged in and we all need to be pushing in the right direction on?
I don't know about speech or issues like that. I think those are complex and beyond my remit. But I do think that we need to, I think a vision I have at least of this isn't just more egalitarian distribution of, money equivalent goods or income, but much more use of it, this technology for specific needs, and much more rapid installation of it into your daily life. Like, I'm not a technophobe in this regard. I actually think that these kind of policies can accelerate the use of AI for very specific problems that aren't always going to be such high, return on investment or return problems, and much more use of it to, engage with public service, to give you for optimizing and improving public services, right? If you get this kind of right as industrial policy, you're boosting innovation, and you're boosting, most importantly, the rate of installation, right? So rather than it being concentrated in those firms that have the operating expenditure ability and the capital of CapEx to do it, and the kind of network effect of it, I want to see lots and lots of firms competing and using this stuff so that you as a consumer to be able to set the terms, right, of what you want these things to solve, and us as a society to be able to set the terms of how we, what direction we're setting the innovation into.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I think that my most confident prediction is that innovation will increase, because having all the data siloed in a small number of really big firms seems to me less likely that new innovative ways to use data and to create new technologies from automation and classifiers and recommendations and whatnot, and a million more ways that data dependent technologies can be used would increase. I do think that this is one tool in the tool belt of addressing concerns of economic inequality specifically. And of course, that's a whole, there's there's issues of global politics, there's issues of law and questions around, I don't even think, maybe actually, Yakov, you might be able to answer me to this. You might be able to answer this for me, sorry. Do economists even agree on what the good level of income inequality is, for instance?
Oh God. I mean, there are all kinds of models of that.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So obviously I don't want to speculate on that, but I certainly think we can kind of slow the brakes on the potential runaway train of data-driven technologies really exacerbating income and wealth inequality in particular.
And I think we shouldn't be afraid of that of innovation, by the way. I kind of want to clarify, by direction of innovation, I mean innovation that doesn't exacerbate inequality, right? That creates good, sustainable growth, not innovation that displaces people into terrible jobs, right? Not less Ubers, more, smart production of solar cells.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, innovation displaces people and puts people into terrible jobs. Does it even deserve to be called innovation?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point, right? What is the innovation here? There's not much actual new stuff here.
Yeah. Or it's the term innovation will lose its positive connotation quite quickly if that's what it means. Is a better way of saying what I'm trying to say. Right? We need to think about the structure of our social institutions and our actual lives when we think about what's next and how we can make the world better.
Yeah, I also just one other thing. I actually do imagine that things like data co-ops exerting data leverage will help with things along the lines of content moderation. And I say help a little carefully because, of course, these are ultimately political topics. And what I think is a good outcome for, assume Twitter has some policy by which they're going to delete posts and block posts and, clean up the bad content. In fact, it's probably going to involve data-dependent technologies and the fact that we've all tweeted here, I think. And so our tweets we will be fueling that particular intelligent technology. So just a real example of data labor. And actually, so Twitter also announced this new Birdwatch program. It's kind of a community moderation program that's drawn some criticism, but also a lot of excitement around the potential for adopting kind of a more Wikipedia-esque crowdsourcing model. Anyway, just to conclude my point here is that if we had data unions right now, when these issues come up, they would let people make their voices heard, basically. They would say, Twitter, my data union has 100,000 people in it, and they agreed with our statement that we don't support, banning political figures, or we do support banning political figures when they're inciting violence. And obviously democracy itself is not, or direct democracy has problems. I think there's maybe some interesting interactions with quadratic voting, actually, for the radical exchange crowd, ways to use data leverage in a manner that tries to take advantage of quadratic voting, in fact. But it'll certainly be more democratic than what we have now. Right now, there's nothing. Like, Twitter can basically do whatever they want. They might get some media attention, and people might go on Twitter and type, "I'm so mad at you, @Jack." Lots of people do that. Sorry, that is the thing that happens when Twitter doesn't adopt the policies they wanted. And people banding together and actually threatening that we're going to withhold the data that's making your AI systems better if you don't change something is going to, I think is a better world than what we have right now. Even if the immediate outcome isn't what I want, I think in aggregate over 10 years, that's a better world. But I guess that's a political philosophy in and of itself. But I guess that's answering the fact that content moderation is a question of politics. But I think what we're talking about here can have a better way of resolving these political disputes than what we have right now. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Democracy is messy, and people are, even when democracy is working well, lots of people are unhappy. Yeah. But it's better than the alternative most of the time. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to talk today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, right.
And if there's anything you'd want to plug before we jump off, go ahead.
Tons of amazing collaborators. There's too many. I can't plug them all because this work and all the work that I've done is like super collective. But I'll specifically plug my lab. So the People, Space, and Algorithms Research Group at Northwestern, my advisor Brent Hecht, and my cohort mate, my equally academically aged PhD student Hunlin Lee, who's in the same program as me. They've been super influential to all this work. Big thanks to them.
Yeah, and just to the three of us are here, but we've had many collaborators and just worked so hard on this report, right? Who just couldn't make this thing because of timing, and I wish they were here. It's actually really unfortunate they are. And I want to, Louisa, Hanlin, Shirag, Brent, we had inputs from all kinds of, a list of people longer than my arm, that we're going to have a whole, separate page for it, right?
Yeah.
This was really, as I said, I came into this thing really skeptical and very, very unsure about the value of doing this work, right? But this was a really great experience, and I think this is really a really important issue.
One more plug, if we can squeeze it in, is that hopefully our report and our website, and maybe this talk itself, will help you to reconceptualize data dividends. A lot of people, when I say I've been working on a project related to data dividends, turn their nose up and say, "Oh, I've heard about this. You're going to give people pittance paychecks and nothing will change." And I think it's really stupid. They didn't say I think it's really stupid to me, but they said a version of that. And hopefully what we've done here can convince you that there could be a really good implementation of what could be called data dividends.
Yes.
Totally agree. I think this is an incredibly important area that more people need to be tracking. If you want to sort of understand the political economic landscape that we're heading into and the major questions of the next decade or two, I think that this is at least one of the most important areas of inquiry, and I'm really proud to have worked with you guys to put out this report. And great to talk to you.
Great talking.
Sweet.
Thank you to everyone supporting Radical Exchange Foundation. This production would not be possible without you. Go to radicalexchange.org and donate. Thank you so much to Nick and Yakov for coming onto the show, and also to the musicians, and to the team, Jennifer Marone and Leon Erickson, for your great production work. Again, check out datadividends.org to find the latest version of the proposal that Nick, Yakov, the rest of the team, and I worked on. And have a great weekend. This is Radical Exchanges. This is a Radical Exchange production.